Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, it's just over 2 weeks ago that Salman Rushdie was attacked in New York. I'm delighted that my guest this week is an expert in radicalisation and terrorism. Wasiq Wasiq is a fellow of the Henry Jackson Society. He's also a specialist in anti-Semitism. Thank you very much for joining us, Wasiq. I wanted to start because this week, just gone, you held a kind of event, didn't you, for Salman Rushdie. Can you tell me what that was?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on.
No, it's a pleasure.
I think the first thing is that my thoughts go out to Salman Rushdie and his family, and I wish him all the best in a quick recovery. Now, the event that I was part of is known as the I Stand With Salman event, and this is essentially a symbolic event to show solidarity to Salman Rushdie in the face of religious fundamentalists who are seeking to prevent those from expressing themselves freely in a free society. And so I delivered a speech there to push back against some of these religious fundamentalists who I believe are a threat to our democracy, a threat to the West, and the threat that they pose, in my view, is not one of legality, but it's one through the back door. So essentially what they're trying to do is to threaten people from being able to express themselves without needing to have a blasphemy law. So essentially it's blasphemy through the back door. And this is essentially what my speech was about.
Well, I think it's sort of almost undeniable that we are living with an unofficial blasphemy law, aren't we now? I mean, were you, when it came to the attack on Salman Rushdie, have you been encouraged or discouraged by the general response to it?
I think there's two things that we need to put into perspective. Yes, of course, the Fatwa, which is a religious edict that was assigned to Salman Rushdie, has since 1988 been applied to Salman, and it hasn't been rescinded. So I'm disappointed that we haven't had religious leaders actually rescinding this or negating this fatwa. So this fatwa has essentially been live for all this time, and therefore Salman's life has always been on the line as a result of this.
Yeah.
But also I am encouraged by other things. What I have seen, at least in the Muslim community, and it's a diverse community, we're not a homogenous bloc, we're not a monolith, is that when it does come to matters of blasphemy, what we don't see is the whole of the Muslim community out there protesting against it. What we do see, however, is a minority of religious fundamentalists who are out there protesting against it. Now, the problem with some of these protests is that there are elements of extremism there, where they're threatening violence, where they're threatening to do things against people who or express themselves freely, whether it's reading the book or promoting it or selling it. And so it is mixed, and I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
You know, I saw actually a tweet you put out, which had caught my eye. This was a while ago. And it was basically during the time where various groups were picketing Cineworld over the film recently that they thought was insulting. And indeed, there was a clip of a guy, I think it was in Birmingham, talking about how there will be repercussions. We have been trained to make sure, and it was very much like a threat. And you said something along the lines of that this is what we are up against. I mean, how widespread do you think that is?
I think it's widespread amongst a minority of fundamentalists within the Muslim community, and they are shouting the loudest. And what they are doing is essentially representing themselves as the go-to people, the spokespeople for a community. And when I saw that clip, it was quite troubling because as far as I know, nothing has been done about it. And as far as I could tell from that clip, it very much appears to be a threat.
Yep.
And when we put it into context, the film that you're referring to, The Lady of Heaven, this was made by a minority Shia sect. So it's a minority within the sect of Shia, and Shia are a sect within the Muslim community. And so they got to push back within their own community, and also from the Sunni community, which is the biggest Muslim sect that we currently have globally. And as part of that, what we saw was that although we didn't see a lot of pushback from the whole of the Muslim community, a minority of that community were allowed to speak on behalf of them and to get that film taken down from cinemas. And so cinemas across the country weren't able to actually show this movie because they weren't aware, or at least they would have done some sort of risk assessment and assessed that this risk of violence or intimidation or threats is too high for us to put this on. And so as a result, the Muslim community are being tarnished because of a minority of religious fundamentalists, and cinemas are not allowed to then put on things that other people want to be able to watch.
Yes. This censorship, the atmosphere of censorship, which basically, if you're talking about, take for example, since 1988, it does appear to have been internalized. I mean, to the extent people say, oh, well, you hear this a lot. Oh, well, we've moved on and that wouldn't happen anymore. You sort of think, well, no, because basically people now keep their mouth shut. I mean, do you think that is a true picture, as I paint it there?
I think there's some truth to that. I think when we look at when the fatwa was initially put out against Salman, we had some politicians saying that Salman perhaps should take some of the blame for why this is happening. And I think that's disgraceful, especially in a Western liberal democracy. We should be standing up for those who want to express themselves and to push back against religious theocrats, such as those who are in Iran. And so there is some truth to that. And when we think about how that's progressed over time, well, it hasn't progressed. What we've seen, it's regressed over time. A classic example, and the most recent one, is that of Batley Grammar School. A teacher, all he had done was shown a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, what happened as a result of that is that we saw a bunch of religious fundamentalists who were there picketing him, and we even had, in fact, a charity naming him on social media, the teacher. As a result, that teacher had to go into hiding. Now, we didn't get much pushback from the government at the time.
No.
I think the right-wing media were very good at actually pushing back against this. The left-wing media were a bit hesitant. It appeared that they didn't know where to place their position. Should they be with the teacher in terms of freedom of expression and to show these sorts of caricatures, or was it with the fundamentalists who were essentially saying that Muslims can't behave themselves when they see this, and therefore we have to actually prevent these things from happening? And this then speaks to a bigotry of low expectations, and it's quite patronizing to assume that we can't handle ourselves when something offensive is shown in front of us.
Does that mean, actually, Wasiq, that, for example, you have no problem with, say, cartoons being shown in the Batley case?
No, absolutely not. There's no child protection issue showing a cartoon. So what is the issue? The issue is only those who are offended who now want to apply their offence to everyone else. So their standards of offence, and that is unfair to anyone else who then wants to see this caricature or not see this caricature. People should have the choice to be able to do that. So if the teacher chooses to show this and a student chooses not to see it, they should be able to leave the classroom. No one should be forced to look at it, but then no one should be forced not to look at it. And that's the situation that the religious fundamentalists seem to want to take control of.
Why do you think it is that, for example, take that school, Batley Grammar School, but let's face it, it could be a whole number of other instances we've had. They wouldn't invite somebody like you along, as it were, to put the other case, would they? I mean, from what I can see, the guys were outside there, pretty much one hands down. The teacher is still in hiding. As you said, virtually, I don't think anyone in the government said anything about it at all. But why don't they have someone like you along and talk about the other way of looking at it?
I think because they're worried about the tension that it could create, that when you've got a Muslim who is standing up for free speech, standing up for freedom of expression against then a mob who are completely against that, this creates tension, and they don't want to be part of that that sort of debate, even though by nature they are part of it and they have to take a stand against it. And I think that's one of the issues that we're facing, is that there are voices, progressive voices within the Muslim community who want to stand up for free speech, who are not being given that platform. I mean, of course, New Culture Forum are giving me that platform, and that's fantastic. But then what about some of these platforms on the left, where we find lots of Muslims who subscribe to that political ideology? We don't hear those voices, and we need to hear more of those voices. We need to amplify the other side, because at the moment we're only seeing the fundamentalist side.
Yeah. So how would you characterize yourself then, Wasiq, on this sphere, on this line of from fundamentalism right through to what? To, you call it progressive Muslim, what?
I'm not entirely sure what to call it, but I mean, I call myself a British Muslim, and I fully subscribe to the British values that we have, whether that's free speech, freedom of expression, the rule of law. I'm perfectly comfortable with having non-Muslim friends, and so I don't bring cultural baggage from other areas where some of these fundamentalists do. So in fact, there are lots of progressive Muslims who don't consider homosexuality to negate their belief in Islam or belief in God, because within Islam, there's only one way of coming into Islam, and that's to declare faith in one God and that the Prophet Muhammad is the messenger. Anything beyond that cannot necessarily negate your identity as a Muslim. And so we do know that there's lots of progressive Muslims who think like this, but we just don't hear them enough.
Yes. Where does this leave you? Does this put you in a dangerous position at all?
Potentially. I get a lot of abuse on social media.
From
fundamentalists, from Islamists, from those on the left who believe I'm giving cover to the extreme right wing, for example. So some of the abuse that I get is I'll be called coconut or a traitor to Muslims. And this is essentially falling into the territory of identity politics. So they're happy to have a brown person there to essentially propagate white supremacist ideas and things like that. So as a result of that, then people are then making threats and on social media. And so I have to be very careful where I go, who I speak to, who I see, because you never know who could be out there. And this is a threat that a lot of those of us who are in that progressive scene, who consider ourselves Muslims, even though others don't, who are facing.
Oh, I see. So you mean basically they're saying to you, you're not even a Muslim, really?
There are cases where they are, and it's known as takfiring. So takfir means to excommunicate. This is an essential tool within the Salafi jihadi ideology. This is something that ISIS actually use, and Al-Qaeda were said of ISIS that even you're too extreme for us when you're using this and applying this to some Sunni Muslims. So the idea is that if you're able to declare someone a non-Muslim, then that person becomes a legitimate target. Right. And so this is what some of these individuals are seeking to do.
I see. It's one thing that in the feedback we get from the show when we talk about these issues, and that is, you use the term Islamism, and I suppose you would say that's sort of religious fundamentalist and Islamist, roughly the same, I suppose. There is a kind of, if you like, violent Islamist and a non-violent Islamist. So in fact, would it be right to say that the people who try to close down a film are non-violent Islamists, would you say?
To an extent, yes. So there are actually three types of Islamists. First, Islamism is distinct from Islam. Islamism is a political ideology, whereas Islam is a religion of peace. And within Islamism, there are three types. There are the violent types. So those are the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, those sorts of people. Then you've got the non-violent Islamists, and so these guys, they believe everything that the violent Islamists do, but they don't carry out anything in terms of violence. And then you've got the participationalist Islamists, and so these guys actually use the machinery of democracy to achieve their aims. Now, the violent Islamists are the ones who are essentially those who are out picketing and using that violent rhetoric to have things closed down.
Right.
And they stop at the point of violence. But that's not to say that they don't subscribe to violence. They're quite happy for someone else to do that for them if it's going to achieve their aims. So that's essentially, so those people who are seeking to shut down the Lady of Heaven,
Yeah.
I would consider them to be non-violent Islamists.
Yes, I see. Because one of the things it is brought up, and I'm sure you've discussed this many times, is some people will say using the term Islamism is a cop-out. It's actually Islam. What would you say to that?
I think that, well, look, Islamism comes from Islam, so you can't deny that. And so Islamism, because it's a political ideology, they draw from Islamic tradition and Islamic teachings, and they hope to use that to then implement it into their way of life in terms of not just their private self, but also the public. And so when we think about Islamism, especially in the West, what they're hoping to do is to make society Sharia compliant. Now, Sharia means, the root word of Sharia is to mean way, a way of doing things. Yeah. And for them, it's the Islamic way of doing things. And one of the Islamic way of doing things is to prevent people from critiquing or ridiculing religion or the Prophet Muhammad. And so they're hoping to achieve a Sharia compliant freedom of expression and speech that is in line with their beliefs. And the only way that they can do that is by essentially threatening people from actually being able to express themselves.
Do you think that when you look at the British establishment, I'm sure you have lots of interaction, don't you? I mean, if you're associated with Henry Jackson Society, etc., in your work, if you look at the people who run the government, and I get the impression that they are quite ignorant, actually, of various different nuances, if that's the right word. Do you think that's the case? I mean, if they don't say anything about a teacher in the Batley Grammar School, if they don't really make comments about some other thing that might have happened, it's because they're worried about offending all Muslims. Is that right?
There's some truth to that, but there's something deeper to this, and this goes to something known as community tension. I remember recently, a few years ago, there was a Christian woman from Pakistan, and she was seeking refuge here in Britain. She wasn't able to come here, and the reason the government gave was because it would cause community tension. And so the question then I have then for the government is either you cannot handle the community tension, you cannot control it, or you've just prioritized them over someone who needed refuge. So there's two things. One, there's the ignorance. So sometimes they're aware of it and they're not doing anything about it. And the other thing is that even when they are aware of it, they still don't seem to be able to do enough about it. And so we're in a situation now where the government seem to be on the back foot against some of these Islamist extremists.
You say that they don't seem to be able to do anything about it. I'd agree. It's a question of why they don't, in the sense that the government, when it wants to do things, can move remarkably fast. Is it just that there's cowardice? That, I mean, for the same reason that, the situation in Rotherham was allowed to go on for a long time, all of those sorts of things, is simply because they are more frightened, actually, as if you put it, of community tension. It's as simple as that.
I think so. I think because they don't want to. We had riots in the 80s, the race riots, and it was very difficult to deal with that. We had riots then in the early 2000s in those northern towns, again race riots, and so they've had bad experiences of these sorts of riots, and they're worried that similar riots are going to happen, and they don't know what to do with it. And so that means that actually the influence that they have in the community is quite weak, and they also need to rely on the community to know that that's not going to happen. The thing is, when we look at lockdown, they were able to lock down the whole country so quickly, yet they can't seem to contain a problem like this. Exactly. And so I don't know what the block is, and they need to show some courage.
Well, I think it's that. You've just said it. I think that they are cowards because they absolutely could. I wonder, where do you stand on the term Islamophobia? Would you say that it is, do you think this thing exists, or would you say, like the late Christopher Hitchens, that it's a made-up term which is basically there to stop people criticising Islam?
I think it's a mixture of both. We know that anti-Muslim bigotry, hatred, prejudice exists. So people are treating Muslims differently because they're Muslims. But when it comes to Islamophobia, and there is a definition that we currently have at the moment that's gained a lot of momentum from all of the political parties except the Conservative Party, who are seeking to define their own. This definition that we currently have is very problematic. It seems to be rooted in critical race theory, which essentially says that all Muslims belong to a race. And there are some problems with this, because what we know, and I mentioned this earlier, that anyone can become a Muslim just by reciting the Shahada, the declaration of faith. And then all you have to do is to reject the Shahada to then no longer be a Muslim. And so you can be white, but you cannot not be white at the same time. You can't come out of your race. So the idea that you can conflate race with religion is palpably false. But it's not just that. Even when we look at the Lady of Heaven as an example, the Islamophobia definition that we currently have actually ignores sectarianism. So you have Sunni Muslims or some Sunni Muslims who hate some Shia Muslims because they're Shia, because they have a different theology. And so if we're talking about critical race theory and it's about color and whiteness and power, privilege, then how can one group who essentially look the same be racist to another group who essentially look the same? One group can't be white and the other group everyone else. And so it ignores that. So there are lots of problems with this definition of Islamophobia. And so when and the question that you asked is, does it exist? Well, according to this definition, I'm not entirely sure what exists. It's just very muddled up.
Yes. I've always seen, it's quite clear to me that, Islamophobia is incorrect simply because it's a religion. I think you've just made that point, and not a race. And that basically, therefore, everyone should be able to criticize religion. That's the way we've kind of grown up in democracies like ours. Do you think, because it's sort of crept in a little bit lately, that Islamists use the whole new woke language? Is that happening? I kind of heard it a little bit around the edges.
Yes, I do think so. They're using this language where they're essentially using the language of diversity and inclusion, and they're hoping to create Muslims into this homogenous bloc. And so all Muslims should think the same, all Muslims should look the same and speak the same and believe in the same thing. Right. And this woke language is very much the same. And so, for example, we know that in the gender wars, people are finding it difficult to now describe what a woman is. But Islamists, what they're hoping to do now is that they're trying to do the reverse and say, well, actually, you can describe what a Muslim is. A Muslim should look like this. So a Muslim woman should be wearing a hijab or a niqab or something like that. So they're using that language or the tactics, at least, that we've seen in this woke ideology and identity politics, to then apply it to themselves and to achieve some of those aims that they're hoping to get.
I see. How did you start out? It's led you to this point. Actually, you personally. I mean, you grew up here, didn't you? So when did these issues start to really become important to you?
I think the turning point wasn't the Salman Rushdie thing, because I was only 6 years old at the time. I wasn't cognizant to what was actually going on there. It was actually 9/11 in 2001. I was at college, and in our canteen we had screens up on the wall, and they were showing the planes going into the Twin Towers.
Where was this? Where was this in?
This was in London, yeah. And when that was happening, there was lots of Muslim students there, and many of my friends. And what they were saying was, yes, they were cheering this on. And I looked at them and said, why? And they're like, it's America, who cares? We don't care. And I couldn't understand what led them to that. But, and my response was that, well, America's not going to take this lying down. They're going to do something about it. And not just that, my response was, what about the victims in those towers? But they didn't seem to care. And this was really worrying for me, because although we had the Salman Rushdie event, we also had lots of people going to Afghanistan and fighting as part of the Mujahideen against the occupation from Russia. And so they saw them as freedom fighters. And so essentially and Bin Laden was, of course, involved in that. And so they saw this as a heroic point for them. And this really led me to reconsider what was happening within my community, within some of my own peers, and what can we do about it. So as a result, I started reading up a lot about why this stuff was taking place, and which then led me to then start working in this area. So I used to work in education, and now work in terrorism and extremism. And what I saw there hasn't necessarily dissipated now. We still see those elements of extremism, and they're being given a free pass, and something needs to be done about that.
You said you were in education. What were you teaching? Or?
So I was a teacher, yes. I was a teacher for over 10 years. I taught music.
Oh, really? What, in London schools?
Yes, in a London secondary schools. And I taught music, I taught drama, even taught a bit of maths, which I was terrible at. But I was already, and many of my community tend to go into law or into accountancy. Yes. So it was quite different for me to go into an industry where you don't see a brown Muslim, devout Muslim, in fact, who prays 5 times a day and fasts and gives to charity. So it was really interesting to see that, but I was very much welcomed in those spaces, and that's something that I think we don't find in some Muslim communities, where they're very welcoming of necessarily the other.
Right. You spoke quite recently as well about the situation that we might face in our prisons, right? Now, again, this is something that's sort of glancingly referred to. It becomes a bit of an issue, and then it sort of just goes away. What would you would say it's pretty dire, right?
Yes, it is very dire. There was a recent report that came out by Jonathan Hall QC. Yeah. It was a government report on Islamists in prison. And what he found was that Islamists are actually controlling some elements of prison and making them Sharia compliant. Essentially, they were making them Muslim friendly or Muslim focused and Islam friendly. And so what he found in the evidence is that prison staff would distribute leadership to emirs. Emirs are essentially commanders within an army, but within the prison there would be prison emirs. So these guys would be controlling the Muslim inmates.
Right.
And this is problematic because the distribution of power from the prison staff to the so-called emirs, the so-called commanders, then actually relieves the prison staff of their duty of actually being able to control the prison. And so what's then the prison for? What they're essentially doing is rewarding these prisoners and instead of punishing them, which is why they're there. And this was a catastrophic failure that we were finding in our prison system.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just that, there were also elements where some Islamist extremists were essentially intimidating staff, using threats of violence to get their way. So Muslims can pray 5 times a day, but it's not essential for them to pray in a congregation 5 times a day. But this is what some of these Islamists were seeking to do. They wanted concessions that no other religious community were getting within those prisons. So being able to come out of their cells to pray in a congregation because that was their right. But when it's not essential for them to need to do that, they could quite easily pray within their prison cell. So it was quite dire. Now, not just that, the last 4 completed terrorist attacks that have taken place from those who were in prison. And so what we're finding is that the prisons are actually failing at what they're meant to be doing, which is preventing some of these guys from carrying out these attacks. So once they're released from prison, they're out there carrying out the attacks. So the Streatham attack was someone who was recently in prison, Fishmongers Hall, and also the Reading attack. And the other attack was one that took place within prisons. And what's interesting about this one, the one that took place within prison, is that that's the first terrorist attack to take place within a prison. And this is extraordinary to see what's actually happening.
But the thing is, it might be the same answer, but when I asked you, why do you think this is happening? Would it be the same weakness that you talked about before in the authorities?
I think so. I think there is now. I think we're talking about a fundamental systemic weakness that we have in our bodies that are meant to be protecting us. And this has come about through, in my view at least, through an environment where we have to think of not offending people before actually dealing with an issue, and that then creates more and more issues. And when these start compounding, you start seeing systemic flaws and a rot within some of our institutions that are meant to be doing something else, but are now at the back foot because they're being held hostage to some of these extremists.
I mean, I mentioned, yes, connected to this really, I talked a little bit before we came on air about this. I mean, what is your view of the PREVENT programme? Because, I mean, frankly, it's had a hell of a lot of criticism, either from from one side because it's basically too lily-livered, from the other side, basically from people who essentially don't want anybody to be under any form of surveillance for whatever reason. I mean, what do you think it's effective or not?
Well, I think
it's all we've got actually at the moment.
It is. It's the best thing that we've got, and it's a well-intentioned initiative that we have. And at the beginning, when it first started, it was bound to have some flaws, and it was bound to have some mistakes in its implementation. Of course, that's going to happen because we were in a situation. This came about after the 7/7 bombings, where 4 homegrown terrorists turned their backs on our country and killed 52 of our British citizens, and over hundreds of people were injured as a result of this. So we have to think about the context in which it came about, and so that gave us our first realization that we've got an Islamist extremist problem, and so we had to do something about it. Now, PREVENT came about, and PREVENT's not perfect, but it came about as a way to deal with that. Now, as it came about, then you had lots of Islamists who were talking about scrapping it because it unfairly targeted the Muslim community, and it was so-called Islamophobic. It was anti-Muslim in nature because most of the people who were being referred to were Muslims. But we were in a situation where we didn't know who was an extremist and who wasn't. And There were examples where I think a child had said, I live in a terraced house, and it was interpreted as a terrorist house, even though he said terrorist. And so they would amplify these examples as, look, this is Islamophobic. We know that the most referrals currently to Prevent are for the extreme right wing, and actually there's a decrease in referrals for Islamist extremism. Now, there's two reasons why that could be the case. It could be that the far right are the fastest rising threat that we're currently facing, which is why we're seeing a high number of referrals for the extreme right wing. Or it could be that there's some sense of cowardness now, and that we're a bit scared to refer Muslims to the Prevent program for being accused of Islamophobia. So yes, that's something that we're facing. So I don't think it's Islamophobic. I think it's a well-intentioned initiative, and I think anyone who thinks that there is an alternative needs to come up with it, and it needs to come under scrutiny, and it can't just be that, oh, it's better because it's not Islamophobic. Well, we don't know that yours isn't going to be any better. You need to show that it's going to work in practice.
Oh, of course. I think that you said it's with Prevent at the moment, it's either one thing or the other, because there's been this supposed increased reporting of right-wing extremism. Yes, that has happened. I would incline to go with your latter view. When I've had any contact with police about Prevent or whatever, it seems to me that they are, how should I put it? They want to equivocate. They want to somehow take the onus off the fact that the vast majority of attacks are Islamist. And so basically, it's almost like they almost overplay the right-wing part of it. And I think, as you say, that there are also cases where people report actually what you wouldn't even consider to be extreme statements, actually, but these suddenly become far right. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But what would you say is the lookout in the next 10 years when it comes to the terrorist threat, when it comes to the terrorist Islamist threat? Do you think are we in the same position we were 7/7?
I don't think we're in the same position. I think we're in a unique position now. I think the position's different slightly. In terms of terrorist attacks, they're less complicated now. So with the 7/7, there was months of planning that took place, and they had to learn how to create these bombs and to know when to detonate them, how and where. When we look at some of the terrorist attacks that have taken place now, they are very much low-effort terrorist attacks. So whether it's the use of a van to run people over, or the use of a knife to do that. And so we're seeing a different type, not necessarily type actually, a different way of carrying out terrorist attacks. Yeah. But the threat from terrorism hasn't declined. In fact, it's increased, and we've seen more and more terrorist attacks. In fact, from the period of 2001 up to 2019, we saw above average deaths as a result of terrorism compared to any other period. And this is excluding, of course, Lockerbie and the IRA when we were engaged in the Troubles. So we have a unique threat. But our threat isn't just that violent threat, it's also that non-violent threat. And so when we're thinking about the non-violent Islamists and the participationist Islamists, and the latter are the ones who use the machinery of democracy, they use that language, they use votes, they use free speech to be able to propagate their ideas. So essentially they're using the tools that we have against us. And so that's the threat that we're now facing, is that we are facing a non-violent threat, and they're finding allies within that woke wing of people, the identity politics, those sorts of people who are trying to cancel people by calling them racist or Islamophobic, overplaying things. So you could have someone who's white and a conservative, and he might say, well, I believe in the institution of a family. Well, automatically he's a white supremacist. So it's those overplaying of some statements and things like that that we're now seeing. And it's how does it manifest? Is it going to manifest necessarily into acts of violence, or is it going to manifest itself into something else, whether it's cancel culture or people just self-censoring? So we are facing a threat in different ways, and I think we need to work out a sensible and intelligent approach to deal with it.
Absolutely, but there's nothing forthcoming from the party political establishment. I think you'd agree, would you?
Yes, I think I would. I mean, the online harms bill seems to be an overreach in terms of tackling some of what we're talking about, because it essentially limits some aspects of free speech and freedom of expression. And one of the key things that terrorists want to do is that they want governments to be to overreach in how they deal with threats that they're faced against. And so the online harm bills, in my view, is one of those ways that instead of responding to extremists in a proportionate way, this is now a disproportionate way, which is limiting some of those allies that we have who could actually take some of these guys on.
Yes. Well, look, Wasiq, thank you very, very much, for today and coming on. It's great to speak to you. And is there anything else that people can do, do you think, when it comes to Salman Rushdie? Is there any other way in which they can sort of make their voices known, to sort of, people say we've got to stand with Salman Rushdie, and it's absolutely right, we have got to. But, okay, you had this event, but how can people generally do it, do you think, just as a way of, if you could just think of any?
Well, I think we need to, especially online, when Charlie Hebdo, when the attacks against Charlie Hebdo happened, we saw the hashtag Je suis Charlie. Even with Black Lives Matter, we saw the hashtag Black Lives Matter or BLM. And so we need to have things like that, these symbolic events taking place where we have Je suis Salman. Something like that. We need to show that actually we are standing with him and against a minority of fundamentalists who are seeking to do something that is completely against our British values of free speech. And one of the arguments that they always make is free speech is not absolute. Well, nobody has ever said it's absolute. We have laws here against hate speech and speech against violence. There are boundaries. And if you want to, and I think what we need to do is we need to invite some of these guys onto a level playing field and to debate them where they get to say what they want and we can actually change their minds. Because I do believe we can change their minds with logic and with reason, because all they bring is emotion, and that's not enough to convince everyone else to your point of view, but we can do something to convince others to ours.
Would you, have you debated these guys in public?
No, I haven't. I don't think they will share a platform with me potentially. Right, okay. I don't know, but I'd be happy to debate them. But I think we need to get the rules of our debate right, and we shouldn't allow them to shout us down, because we should either shout back at them or we sit down and behave in a civilized way, in a British way, and actually do this properly.
Thank you again, once again. We'll see you very much. That's it for So What You're Saying Is this week. We shall see you next time. Thank you very much. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.